there's another 6 or 7 chapters to go and another 11 plus years. But that certainly is a pivotal point, chapter 6 and verse 15, the wall is finished. And when you get to chapter 7, it picks up the story with after the wall had been rebuilt. So what happened afterwards? And what did happen afterwards was just as critical as rebuilding the wall. Because in the second half of Nehemiah, the emphasis will shift from the city to the society, from the wall to the people. It will change from stones to living stones, God's people. And what was needed after the wall had been rebuilt was that the people should be rebuilt. This is about the reforming of the people of God once they were now in their city, and if you like, safe within their city, once they were now behind these walls. And it was done very quickly, rebuilding the wall, but rebuilding people takes a lot longer. Have you noticed that? If you're involved in any kind of ministry, looking after people, helping them in various ways, somehow you wish I was just building a wall, because if you put bricks together, at least they stay where they're meant to be, and you know when you're finished. With people, it's a bit messier, isn't it? Yes. So, the second part of the book is very much about the society within the city, the people within the wall. In the first half of the book, it's the people that are serving the wall, as in building it, and then after that, the wall serves the people by keeping them safe while something else happens. So rebuilding the wall was not the end, it was a means to an end. Because after all, what's more important, stones or people? People. And if people are to be living stones brought together for the glory of God and to serve the world, then God doesn't want us to be a collection of isolated stones sitting around like broken down rubble. What does he want us to become? A dwelling place for his presence, a holy temple joined together, built on strong foundations, rising to his glory. And that can take longer. But I think in the second part of the book, we get some idea of what was necessary to make that work. And so the change in emphasis from chapter 7 is very interesting. And one thing that comes to the fore is, well, firstly, someone new, though he's not really new, and you'll find it in chapter 8, really, chapter 8, when the 7th month came. You'll find that Ezra starts to come into the story. Now, Ezra had already been there, of course. He hadn't just turned up. He'd been there all along, no doubt taking part in the rebuilding of the wall. But now he has a very important job or role or function within the people of God, and that is to bring to them the book of the law. And so in the second half of Nehemiah, there's a great deal about the book of the law. And Ezra's role comes into play on that. So that's why I called the book that I wrote, The Wall and the Word. You got that now? That's why it's called The Wall and the Word. To emphasize that Nehemiah isn't just about building a wall, it's about getting the Word of God into people's lives so that they can be rebuilt, reformed, and come together as a society of God's people. So when I was going through the book and deciding what to do, firstly in the short talks and then into the chapters, firstly I thought, well, we'd better go through the whole book. So roughly chapter by chapter, but not necessarily 1, 2, 3, 4. But the idea was to go through the whole book to explain what was going on. Not like a commentary, not as such, but to expound the text. And then as I did that, I realized that certain topics came to the fore and needed a bit more explanation and a bit more understanding that would help us to not only understand what was going on in Nehemiah, but in later things for ourselves as individuals and within churches and so on. And so 3 topics seem to come to the fore in this. One was enemies and opposition. Now, if you have read recently the book of Nehemiah or know a lot about it, then you'll realise that there was a lot of opposition to what Nehemiah was trying to do. And that in itself is a fascinating study. But out of that, I wanted to bring some more lessons on what it was like for us. So today, in the second half of our time together, I'm going to focus in on that topic, which is one of the parts of the second part of the book that I've written. So I shall talk generally about the book of Nehemiah for a while now, and then after our coffee break, come back and look at that particular topic. But the other two topics, which I said jumped out at me as I was going through it, was obviously, first of all, the book of the law. What exactly was this book that they read? And what difference did it make to them, if anything? What was going on there? Why was it so important? And the other thing that I noticed was that they rediscovered, through their reading of the book of the law, the Feast of Tabernacles. And I thought, I bet a lot of Christians don't know very much about the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, you, of course, know everything about the Feast of Tabernacles, don't you? Well, you know quite a bit, I'm sure, and together with all the other feasts, because I'm sure you've been taught on them very regularly. But I thought that it was worth putting a section in the book on the Feast of Tabernacles generally, because that was something that when they discovered it in their Bible reading, they suddenly realised, wow, we've been missing out here. So let's learn more about it. Let's start to do it straight away. I don't think it was coincidence that they discovered in their reading about the Feast of Tabernacles just a short while before it was due, so that they could sort of get on with it straight away. So in part two, as I say, I tackle three topics, and in the first part, I go through each bit. So let me, in the next few minutes, take you through different aspects of the book of Nehemiah without in any way trying to cover everything, but just enough to give you some insights into what it is. So who was this guy Nehemiah? What do we know about him? Well, the answer is very, very little. Not much detail is given about him at all. Apparently, he had a father. Well, that was useful. But you'll find it in the first verse there. He had a father. It always starts, doesn't it? Somebody's son of so-and-so. So there's a guy called Hakaliah who was his father. That's it. No other background. Don't know if he was married. Don't know if he had any children. We don't know exactly how old he was at the time when he was born. We don't know when or where he died. No details like that. Wife, children, no background. Nothing to say about a great spiritual calling as such, like you get with some people, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and so on. No, in many ways, he was, I won't call him a nobody, but he was a sort of anybody. In other words, when we read about him, we can think, that might have been me, or it could be me. It can inspire us to think that God takes someone like that and can use him for a very great purpose. So I quite like the idea that we don't know all about him and he hasn't got a great biography written up to impress us. He probably had a brother. There's a mention of a brother in a couple of chapters. But of course, brother might just mean fellow Israelite. But probably he did have a brother. They often did in those cases. And the other thing that everybody probably knows about Nehemiah was that he was a cupbearer to the king. Okay, everyone knows that was his job. We don't know how he got that job. We don't know how long he had had that job. But he was a cupbearer in the Persian court in a place called Susa to King Artaxerxes. Now, a cupbearer was quite important. He was more than just a butler, more than someone that just sort of turned up at meal times and said, "Here's your wine, Your Majesty." One of the jobs he probably had was to check that it hadn't been poisoned, because kings in those days were absolutely paranoid about being assassinated at any moment. People didn't usually poison them. They found other ways of disposing of unwelcome leaders and monarchs. But just to make sure, usually the cupbearer had to check the food and the wine beforehand, because after all, if it was poisoned and he keeled over. Well, that didn't matter so much, did it? But that was his job. But it was a bit more, as I say, than being a butler or a low-level servant. He was more like a valet or a personal confidant. He would spend time with the king and the queen. He would be trusted, respected, and so he had a very interesting position within the court. His name means comfort, or is related to comfort. You probably know that Hebrew words have 3 consonants that define them. Nehemiah, and in his case, Nehemiah, comes from the word meaning comfort. You might know other people who had a similar sort of root, and therefore also to do with comfort. If I say Nehemiah, do you think of someone else? The prophets? Nahum, okay, Nahum, if you like. And even Noach, his name relates to comfort as well. And if you put Yah at the end, I-A-R, from Yahweh, you get, therefore, comfort and God in the same name. So whether he was comforted by God or brought the comfort of God, you can make your own minds up on that. But Nehemiah had a very comfortable position in his life, and suddenly it became very uncomfortable. He was prepared to go out of his comfort zone in order to do what God wanted him to do. We'll look at a little bit of that in a moment, perhaps. One other interesting thing about the book of Nehemiah is that it was never disputed that it should be in the Jewish scriptures. It was firmly established in the canon of what we call the Old Testament without any debate or dispute. But of course it appears in part of their scriptures called the writings. So you might know that the Jewish scriptures have 3 parts: the law, the prophets, and the writings. The Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim, together making up the Tanakh. But Nehemiah was put into the writings section, basically level 3, after the law, which was the top bit, and then the prophets, and then tucked away in the rest of stuff. Now the Torah was read regularly in the synagogues as a cycle, wasn't it? Every week they had the Torah portion, which took them through it all in the year. And certain parts of the prophets were read regularly in the synagogue, but the writings, no. Some of the books of the writings were read every year at a feast. So certain books were attached to certain feasts. But not even Nehemiah had that privilege. So when was it read? Who knows? How often did they study it? As Jewish people in Jesus' time, for instance, no idea. So it was never disputed, but somehow it wasn't really taken on board as a highly significant book for them to learn from. And that's probably why it's never quoted in the New Testament, and Jesus never mentioned it, or did any of the others in the New Testament. But it's an important part of God's story with his people, because actually the central character of Nehemiah isn't Nehemiah. Who do you think it is? It's God. Because like all their books, it's about God and his people, not just the people of God. So although it wasn't probably read or studied regularly, it would have meant something to them because it showed them about God at work within their past, within their history. So how does the book actually begin then? How do we get into this story? Well, the first chapter reminds us about Nehemiah's job. We learn about it actually, I think, at the end of chapter 1, or somewhere in the end of the first section of chapter 1. Yeah, verse 11, I was cupbearer to the king. That is the end of chapter 1. But Nehemiah one day gets some news. He's in Susa, he's a long way away in the Persian Empire, and he gets news back from Jerusalem that things are not good. Not good. In fact, I think it's described as being in sort of disgrace. Those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem, I should say, is broken down and its gates burnt. So they've gone back. There's already been 2 returns from exile, and Ezra would have gone earlier in the second return. But at this point, Jerusalem is still effectively not a city. The wall is broken down, the gates are burnt, and therefore the people are in trouble, at least those that live there or thereabouts, because they've got no defence, they've got no city they can go into and be defended from any attackers, and also in disgrace, because in those days, if you like, the security of your city, the prosperity of it, the way you were able to live, said something about your God. So the others still in the area will look at the Jewish people and say, well, your God isn't up to much. Look at your city. Look at the way you're living. You're in disgrace as opposed to God's grace. And when he heard that news, basically it says, I sat down and wept and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before God. So he could have said, well, it's not doing me. I'm a long way away. I'm okay doing what I'm doing. I'm serving the king of Persia. Surely I'm where God wants me to be. I'm doing a good job here. But when he heard this news, and we don't know if he'd he'd not been there before, had he? Because they'd been in exile for all this time. He didn't even have come from there originally, I don't suppose. But somehow it tugged at his heartstrings. And it says he wept, and for some days he mourned and fasted and prayed. And then we get this wonderful prayer in chapter 1, which is worth a study in its own right at some point, as how to approach God in that sort of situation. So he spends a long time seeking the Lord on this. And in fact, you'll find that even though he wasn't personally responsible for what had happened, he includes himself in this, like a lot of good prayers of confession and so on. He includes himself in all this. Now, the book of Nehemiah is often regarded as a good one to study when you want to understand leadership. Let's take Nehemiah as an example of leadership. Well, I'm not convinced that you can understand everything about leadership just by looking at Nehemiah, particularly by the end, which I shall have to mention before I finish how it ends. But there's one thing here about leadership which stands out. If you're going to make a difference for God, one, you're going to have to associate with the sufferings and problems of your people. And then also you're going to have to bring it to God repeatedly, as he did for days and days and days, in order to get God's heart on this. There are going to be many times in the remaining parts of the book, the other 12 years if you like, when he would need to pray to God. Usually quickly, short prayers, almost sort of desperation prayers. But he could do that because of these weeks and months of consistent prayer about the situation before God. And that, I think, gave him almost the spiritual right, if you like, to do this. But he was prepared to be the answer to his own prayer, if you like, because he was going to go and be the one that would start to put this right. But he waits, and if you do a little bit of maths on the time scale, we've got the month of Kislev in chapter 1 and the month of Nisan. That's a few months, is it 3 or 4 months apart? But he doesn't go thinking, I've got to get on with it, I've got to pack my bags, off I go. Nor does he suddenly think, I better go and tell the king about this. He waits until it's the right time. He's been very wise, very diplomatic, and very polite about it. And he just keeps praying and fasting. And he can't go and say something to the king because it will get him into trouble. It's not his job he has to wait until one day the king notices something about him. In fact, it's quite remarkable that the king takes any notice at all about his servants. Why would he suddenly say to one of his servants, "You're not looking very good today," or "Something's saddening you, what is it?" But as I said, Nehemiah was more than just a servant. He was someone that would be respected and trusting in all this. And so eventually it comes to the king's attention that Nehemiah is struggling, suffering, and so on when it comes to this particular issue. And at that point, when it says then, "I prayed to the God of heaven and I answered the king," that's like, "Okay, Lord, tell me what to say now. Tell me what to say now." That's one of those arrow prayers that we sometimes talk about because we want to get the words right at this time. And he manages somehow to bring the king round to the point where he says, "Oh, okay, you want to go and do this? Fine by me." Which is quite remarkable in some ways. God has been preparing the way, obviously, in this. Can the king do without Nehemiah for a while? Probably got other people who could carry the cup and do other things, but he's prepared to let one of his main and trusted servants go off for a while to do this. How long are you going to be, Nehemiah? Don't know. It's almost like a sort of absence of leave without any sort of coming back. He didn't resign, I don't think, but there's no indication that Nehemiah felt, well, if I'm just away for a year or two, then I'll be back. As I said, the book lasts 12 years, but there's a little twist in it along those lines. But he was bold enough at that point to ask the king for certain privileges and certain important things, like he would need letters. This is a long journey that he was going to make. It's over 1,000 miles, I think, between Susa and Jerusalem, and it would take him several months. He wasn't going to go on his own, he was going to go with other people. They were going to collect wood on the way, because he'd learnt that the gates were burnt. And he needed letters of introduction so that when he got to a different area, nobody attacked him or thought, "Well, what are you doing here? I'm on the king's business here. I'm going to Jerusalem for a purpose." I want to stress something that came out when I looked at these first two chapters, rather, that I see Nehemiah in the presence of two different kings. Before he goes into the presence of the king of Persia, he spends time in the presence of the king of heaven. And that's the right way round. Who is he serving more than the other? The king of heaven, first and foremost, and then he's serving the king of Persia. So he treats his job and his position with the king with great respect and so on, but he knows that he's got another king that he's always serving as well. But he's got the favour now of both, if you like. And so it just says in chapter 2, verse 11, "I went to Jerusalem." There we are. All nice and easy. I set off and I went to Jerusalem. But we find in chapter 2 and verse 10, this is a really good story, a good narrative, because you get a little hint here that things aren't going to be all that straightforward. Everything's been wonderful so far. The king has said yes to him, given him all that he wants. Off he goes to Jerusalem, doesn't seem to have any problems on the way, on the journey. But we learn in verse 10 that two people in particular are not going to be very happy with what Nehemiah is going to do. And we meet here Sanballat and Tobiah. Now, if you read the book of Nehemiah, those two names crop up time and time again. And I want to draw your attention to the particular phrase that when they heard about this, in other words, that Nehemiah was on his way, with letters from the king, with people and resources and so on, they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. That's chapter 2 and verse 10. They were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Jewish people. Isn't that often the case? Yeah? And certain things struck me about this. Firstly, just someone. Who was Nehemiah? He was just someone. This wasn't some big name or whatever. No one knew about him really at this point. But someone had come. And someone had come, or was on his way, if you like, had gone out of his way on this long journey out of his comfort zone into something unusual, difficult, and so on, and to promote the welfare of the Jewish people, the Israelites. Now, why were they disturbed, in fact very much disturbed? Because this is the beginning of how the opposition is going to grow and mount. Well, we'll have to think about who these two people are in a moment. But firstly, what they really wanted was the Israelites to stay in this position where they didn't have a good city, where they were very much still open to attack or not in a good position with God and so on. They wanted to keep them down there. They wanted to suppress them. These people wanted the status quo because they were going to say, if Israel get their city, get Jerusalem, then this is going to make a big difference to the whole region. And that's going to put us under pressure, and we don't want that. Because if the Jewish people come back in greater force with a rebuilt city, then it's going to make us a little bit less secure and so on. Now, who are these two people, Sanballat and Tobiah? Well, the thing you notice about Tobiah is that he's described as an Ammonite. An Ammonite. What we learn about Sanballat is that he was an Horonite. I can say it, Horonite. Now, people say then, okay, what does that mean? Where's that? Well, the best understanding of where Horon is it was in the land, the territory of Moab. Okay? So what we've got here is a Moabite and an Ammonite. Does that ring any bells with you as to who they were and what that's all about? Does anyone know the background to the Ammonites and the Moabites, where they came from originally? It's in Genesis somewhere. Does anyone know where these people groups came from? Lot and his daughters, yes. There's a very unwholesome story, really, that after Lot had been rescued from Sodom and Gomorrah, he got drunk, and his daughters took advantage of him and had children by their father. And they named them in such a way. One was renamed after, it was called Moab, I think. Ab at the end is father, isn't it? Moab. So it's something like from the father or something. That's where I got my child from the father. And the other one, Ben Ammon, something similar to that as well. So these people groups were based upon incest with Lot and his daughters. That's in Genesis 19, if you really want to read that sort of stuff. We ought to read it all, and so on. But the other thing that you might remember about the Moabites and the Ammonites is that they were not friendly towards the Jewish people. And when the Israelites left Egypt and were going into the Promised Land, they wouldn't help them. I think they refused them food and water and something. And what God said to them was, to the Israelites, is, although you're related in some way, these are not really the sort of people that you can have dealings with. But you don't harass them. God had given them certain land and looked after them in that sense, but he didn't want them intermingling with the chosen people. So there was a lot of history, if you like, there, and there's a lot of initial opposition between the Ammonites, the Moabites, and indeed the Israelites. So that's part of the background to all this. And you'll see at one point, Nehemiah has to say to them, it's at the end of chapter 2, when he answers them by saying, the God of heaven will give us success. I love those little phrases where Nehemiah combats the opposition by just a simple phrase, God will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding, but as for you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it. Now, that's not very diplomatic if you're trying to get people on your side, but it was true. It was true historically that they were not going to have any part in this, and therefore they had to be very much kept at arm's length. But the opposition would grow and grow and grow. In chapter 2 and verse 10, they were just very much disturbed. We'll see later how they developed this opposition. We'll pick out some other little bits as we go through it. Tobiah actually sounds a very nice name, really. If you think about it, it sounds very Jewish, doesn't it? Tov Yah, good and God, But names can be deceptive. Sinbalat seems to relate to the moon god Sin. So it's not sin as in, bad things. It seems to refer to a moon god. That's his sort of background. And it's based upon the idea of this God has given me life or something. So two different kinds of enemies there perhaps, but equally problematic to what's going to happen. And so by the end of actually chapter 2, when you get to verse 19, and you get another guy here as well, Geshem, joining in, they mocked and ridiculed. They mocked and ridiculed. So they're very much disturbed, and they started off by mocking and ridicule. That's how opposition can begin. You'll be mocked and ridiculed. May not seem very much, but it can be the beginning. And it can still be hurtful, can't it? Have any of you been mocked recently for your faith? Ridiculed because you believe the word of God, or you stood up for something? Okay, that's how opposition can just begin. And they actually asked Nehemiah a very interesting question. Are you rebelling against the king? Now, and don't forget that if they're talking to Nehemiah, everyone else is hearing this. Okay, so here he is. He's turned up from the king, and so on. The first thing is that he's got to get the Israelites on his side, if you like, so that they agree to him being their governor, and also that they'll do the work that he feels God has for them to do. So the first little sort of, let's put some doubt in their minds from the enemies is, are you doing this against the king? Are you rebelling by doing this? Have you come here in order to, he's going to be challenged with this again and again, to take power for yourself? Are you doing this out of the wrong motives? And that was a very serious accusation. Now, I think that Nehemiah was sort of safe on that one because he got letters from the king to say, no, I've come with his permission. Okay? Because they could have accused him of, okay, you're trying to re-establish the Jewish people, rebuild Jerusalem, and then you will sort of break away and cause problems for the Persian Empire. And he said, no, that's not my aim. I've not come here with any great ambitions of my own. But it's a telling little question that, are you rebelling against the king? The first thing he had to deal with, if you like, was that. Now in chapter 3, there's one thing that is absolutely fascinating about the book of Nehemiah, and that's how many times you get lists. Okay? If your daily reading is Nehemiah chapter 7, you've probably grown because you've got a great long list of names. And then when you think you've done that, you get to chapter 10, and there's another great list of names. And you get to chapter 12, and there's another great list of names. And chapter 3 is similar to that, in that you get lots and lots of just, this person did that person did that, and so on. There's lots of lists of names. Now, something I perhaps should have said earlier, but it's worth pulling in now, is that I mentioned that Ezra was very much part of this story, and that he was already back there in the second return from exile. Now, Ezra was a scribe, as well as a teacher of the law, and it's quite possible that Ezra actually wrote up the book of Nehemiah, as well as the book we call Ezra. Now, in the Jewish scriptures, Ezra and Nehemiah are combined into one book, or we should say one scroll. It's called Ezra and Nehemiah. Are you familiar with that, or that sort of idea? That it's the same with Kings and Chronicles. We've split them up, but it's really one book in the Jewish scriptures and so on. So in fact, Ezra and Nehemiah is all one book, and probably therefore compiled in total by Ezra himself. And I just said Chronicles is also one book, and it's assumed, perhaps reasonably, certainly Jewish tradition, that the chronicler was also Ezra, so that he produced 1 and 2 Chronicles, which is really just Chronicles, and Ezra and Nehemiah, and therefore he put together these 4 books at this time. Because Chronicles is not a repeat of Kings, it's much, much later in history. I need to come back to those dates actually. I said 445 to 433 BC. Now I don't know whether that strikes you in any particular way. If I said, where is Nehemiah in the Old Testament, you'd say, well, I found it, it's after Chronicles, and it comes before Job and the Psalms, it's somewhere in the middle. But that's misleading. Actually, Nehemiah is right at the end of the New Testament, as of the Old Testament story. What comes after Nehemiah, after 433 BC? Nothing. Or at least nothing until 400 years later, John the Baptist comes on the scene and starts crying in the wilderness and proclaiming the Messiah. So actually, Ezra and Nehemiah, together with Chronicles, is the last portion of your Old Testament scriptures. It's the last bit of the Jewish canon. And so if you want, that the very end of Nehemiah is the very last thing that's recorded before we have these 400 years of silence. And that's why I do like the very last phrase in Nehemiah, which is, remember me with favour, O my God. I think that's a lovely way to end, particularly as then there's going to be centuries of waiting and nothing happening. But remember me with favour. That's much better than the end of Malachi, which is what we tend to think is where the Old Testament ends, where it talks about God smiting the earth with a curse. That's not a very nice way to end the whole of those scriptures. I'll tell you something else interesting, as I'm sort of in full flow on this at the moment. If you read the end of Chronicles, you might think, does that really finish there? The very end of the second book of Chronicles. What you tend not to do, because you don't read your Bible in this sort of way, is then think, well, I'll start the next book while I'm here. So you get to the end of Chronicles and you think, well, that was sort of interesting, what do I read next? But if you go straight on into the book of Ezra, you'll find that Ezra chapter 1 begins exactly as 2 Chronicles ends. So in 2 Chronicles, the last chapter, towards the end, it says, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, etc., etc., this is what Cyrus, the king of Persia, says. You open the book of Ezra and read, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord, spoken by Jeremiah, it's exactly the same. And this is what the Cyrus, king of Persia, says. So why is about the last 3 verses of Chronicles exactly the same as the opening of Ezra? You almost feel perhaps the scroll had run out at that point. And Ezra, who's writing it all, thinks, well, I'll get another bit of paper and I'll start again, but I better go back to what I've just written in the first year of Cyrus. And what you learn from that is that when you get to the end of Chronicles and it says, may the Lord his God be with him and let him go up, you think, okay, go up? What is that all about? Go up where? When you read it in Ezra, it tells you where. It says, may his God be with him and let him go up to Jerusalem in Judah. That's in the 3rd verse of Ezra chapter 1. So it's as though Chronicles are just finished with let him go up, ... Where? What happens? Ezra picks up the story and continues with that. So the point I'm getting at is that this whole chunk of scripture, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, all belongs at the very end of your Old Testament story, and then we're left for 400 years until John the Baptist comes. And I think that might be quite important. Again, perhaps come back to that later. But I digressed a little bit because I sort of missed it out really early on. In chapter 3, you've got the first of these lists in which you've got about 38 names in 42 groups rebuilding the wall. And this was Nehemiah's tactics or his strategy and his skill that he got everybody involved in building. Everybody. And the idea was that everybody would build a bit near to where they lived or were going to live. Because that gives you a bit of an incentive, really, doesn't it, to get on with it and make it good and strong. But in fact, many people came who weren't going to live in Jerusalem. They were in the surrounding area, and they came to help out. There's lists of people from all sorts of different places, Jewish people. There's, for instance, people from Tekoa and so on. So, although when you read through this, you think, oh, it's this person did that and this person did that and so on, and just reading it, it doesn't seem very interesting. But if you think it through, what's actually happening, I think it's one of the most fascinating parts of the book. Everybody's doing their bit, and everybody's helping out, with one or two exceptions. It says the nobles of Tekoa didn't really want to take part in this. It was sort of beneath them, they're the nobles. But in another place, you learn that the goldsmith and the perfume maker were working side by side. And they might have said, well, that's not really my job. I'm not a hands-on person. I work in gold, or I produce perfume. Give me something to do with that. No, they decided everybody was going to take part in this. And they're commended for it. This sort of list of names isn't there just to bore us part way through and make us think, oh, should I read the rest of this book? It's there to show us something. They're being honoured, these people. They're being honoured for their part, their role in this amazing task under Nehemiah's leadership. And Nehemiah had, when he first got there, he took a little bit of time just to work out the situation. He had a 3-day sort of rest after his long journey and did a little bit of a recce of the a part of it before he then talked to people and said, you see the trouble we're in? You see it's all in ruins and its gates have been burned with fire? Come, let's rebuild Jerusalem and we'll no longer be in disgrace. And I told them about the gracious hand of my God upon me and what the king had said to me. And they replied, let's start rebuilding. Let's do it. This is what they've been waiting for, really. On their own, they hadn't got going. But when Nehemiah came, saying, and the hand of my God has been upon me, and also I've got the blessing of the king of Persia, which is helpful, they said, okay, let's do it. So they began this good work. And that's how it could be done in 52 days, because everybody did their bit. Now, is there a message for us there? Well, I think so. Church isn't about one or two people doing everything, is it? It's about everybody doing something. And it's about leadership motivating people to do something so that everybody does what they can do. And then together, it all happens in that sort of way. So that was part of Nehemiah's skills, if you like, that he had to deal with motivating people, and he did that very well. In chapter 4, though, now Sanballat comes back into it again. Now he's not just disturbed because someone has come, he's even more disturbed because someone is doing something. They are rebuilding the wall. In chapter 4, verse 1, he now says he became angry and greatly incensed. And those are very strong words. It's like he was livid. He was fuming. And so he moved up the opposition to another level. And he didn't just mock and ridicule. Well, he did still ridicule to some extent. But actually they begin eventually to plan and to plot how they can disrupt this work completely. And they got to half the height of the wall, verse 6 of chapter 4. We rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height. So they didn't just build a big bit here and a big bit there. They were doing it all the way around at the same time and gradually building it up, which made more sense. Now, half the height, I think, is still about the height of 2 men, something like that, if you take other major cities and their walls. And very, very thick, perhaps a couple of meters thick as well, maybe more, I don't know. So it was a long way round, a couple of miles, very thick, and going to eventually be very high in order to be successful. So even at half the height, that was quite an achievement. And it adds for the people who had worked with all their heart. And that made them angry. the enemies, the opposition, were very angry. So by the time you get to chapter 4 and then verse 8, Sanballat, Tobiah, and all the others that were in opposition to this plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and stir up trouble. But, Nehemiah says, we prayed to our God. Prayer was going to be absolutely significant in this. And it says, we posted a guard day and night. He was sensible as well. He was practical as well as prayerful. And so he arranged that some people could keep on building if others were sort of looking out to make sure they weren't being attacked. And so other people had the swords ready and so on. And it even says at one point we didn't change our clothes, we didn't sort of rest, and nothing happened until we were absolutely sure. Half the men did the work, the other half were equipped with spears, shields, bows, weapons, armour, and so on. And they also, I think, had people with trumpets ready to sound the alarm. But it says, when our enemies heard that we were aware of their plot and that God had frustrated it, their plot, we all returned to the wall, each to his own work. In other words, the attack never came because of the prayer and the sensible practicalities of it. Now, there's something else that Nehemiah has to deal with, which is there in chapter 5. As well as external opposition, he has internal problems to deal with because the Israelites weren't sort of very kind to each other, that's one way of putting it. And in fact, it took some people to raise the outcry. I won't go into the details of what was going on, but it was to do with collecting interest from people and putting their own people into slavery and so on. In other words, they weren't really behaving properly as the people of God at this point. So what Nehemiah has to do here is come to terms with an internal problem. Otherwise the work would stop because the people were busy arguing and fighting themselves, amongst themselves in this. And so he has to get together the other leaders, the nobles or the priests and everything, and say, look, this behaviour that's wrong towards each other has to stop. No debate, no sort of, what should we do about it? Nehemiah's very strong here. Stop doing this. Stop doing this. And they agree. They agree. They realise that they were wrong. Now you can see why later on the book of the law had to be read to people, because otherwise they wouldn't do what God wanted, even if they've got a nice city, big walls and so on. How are they going to make sure that they lived properly in it if they didn't have the law of God read to them? Now, what I didn't say earlier is what this book of the law really was. Obviously it was something to do with Moses, but does that mean it's the same books that we have in our Bibles? Was it another book? Was it just part of it? I don't think anyone really knows, because maybe they had other documents, other manuscripts, which said the same things as that we've got in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and so on. They had their own scrolls, if you like. But clearly, they had to listen to what God said to them when he spoke to them through Moses earlier. So, and in fact, we won't have time for this later, but if you read on in the story, Ezra gets them together, and I think at one point he reads the scriptures to them for 3 hours, or even 6 hours. I think they have half the time in worship and half the time in hearing the word of God read out to them. Lovely, isn't it, eh? You've only got me for, a couple of hours. They had Ezra to put up with for 3 hours, 6 hours and so on. But they loved it, they needed it, they wanted it, they were hungry for it. Everybody gathered together, and it says that it was explained to them as well. It wasn't just read, as though, well, there you are, that's it, you've heard it. There were other people that would help explain what was needed so that they could put it into practice. But all that was not to happen until the full wall was completed. And just one other thing, perhaps, once he's dealt with the situation in chapter 5, which again ends with the lovely phrase, "Remember me with favour, O my God, for what I've done for these people." In chapter 6, we find that there's more opposition again. because eventually it says, had rebuilt the whole wall and not a gap was left in it. So we get to the point where all the wall has now been rebuilt, full height, though it adds, had not yet set the doors in the gates, that's right. So at that point, which we'll come back to in the second half, got this wonderful wall with some holes in it, some gaps, ready to be filled, because you need gates. That's an important point for later. But anyway, they're pretty well done, the whole of the wall. We're heading towards the point where we could say, so the wall was completed in 52 days, except for the doors and the gates. That's why they needed wood, don't forget. The stones, a lot of the stones will still be there. So they could probably need some new stones, but a lot of the rubble they could reuse for rebuilding the wall, apparently. Don't quite know how that works, but that seems to be right. But what happens in chapter 6 is, the more the work of God goes forward, the more success they have, the greater the opposition. It builds and it builds and it builds. Does that make sense? You feel that? Yeah. And now they scheme against Nehemiah personally. And one thing it says in chapter 6 is, come, let's meet with you. Let's go to one of the villages on the plain of Ono, which was a long, long way away. It's about 40 miles away from Jerusalem. So let's get you out of home territory. Let's get you to where you're probably not quite as secure as you'd like to be. Let's meet together on this plain of Ono. And Nehemiah was wise enough to know that they were scheming to harm him. So his response was, oh no, you don't. We're not going to do that. Basically he says, I'm carrying on such a great project and cannot go down. I can't stop, I'm too busy. They tried 4 times to get him to go out on his own there, so that probably they could attack him and kill him. It had got to that stage. And then the worst bit in chapter 6 is that when that didn't work, they sent round this unsealed letter. Now what that means is that was open for anyone to read. Normally if you sent a letter, it was sealed so that nobody could read it. If it's unsealed, the messenger himself can have a good read of it, and it will soon get round. And so Sanballat sent his assistant with this letter in which is written, it's reported amongst the nations, and Geshem says it's true, so it must be, that you and the Jews are plotting to revolt. Comes back to this idea of rebelling against the king. And that's why you're rebuilding the wall. Because according to these reports, you're about to become their king. And you've even appointed prophets to make this proclamation about you in Jerusalem. You've even got your coronation all worked out. And so that people can say, there's a king now in Judah. And then this report will get back to the king of Persia, and then that will bring down big, big trouble upon us all. Let's confer together. And Nehemiah's response is basically fake news. Or a load of rubbish. Nothing like what you are saying is happening, you're just making it up out of your head. Fake news. He didn't attack the messenger, he attacked the message. He said, this is nonsense. They're trying to frighten us, okay, with these false reports. And other things in this chapter, just very briefly, there were false prophets involved as well that basically said, let's meet up together. Let's meet up in the house of the Lord, inside the temple, because people are coming to kill you. So they're coming at night, so let's go together and meet in the temple. I think that was to lure him away again, so that he might be attacked, and so on. So there was huge opposition which built up over this time of these 52 days. But then, to end where I started really, the wall was completed on the 25th of the month of Elul in 52 days. And when all our enemies heard about this, all the surrounding nations were afraid and lost their self-confidence because they realized that this work had been done with the help of our God. Hallelujah. Amen. Amen. I think it's a good place to pause so we can have a drink. But I'm happy to take questions or have a general chat. Don't know how that's going to fit in with the recording and the zooming that's going on. But I've spoken for an hour, which is more than enough. And I think I've taken you through the essence of the book of Nehemiah. I will talk about the ending next time and more about the enemies and opposition that I think we need to be aware of, because what happened to Nehemiah can happen to us, does happen to us, and the more you step out of your comfort zone and do what God has told you to do, the more you'll find opposition. Yeah.